I'm a barrister. I practice in employment law and crime, so I'm never out of work. I'm looking forward to this webinar. He is a fantastic speaker, as all the speakers we've had on the Lunch and Learns are. But I'm especially grateful to him because he is a world-class trainer, and especially trains, well, I don't know if especially, I've seen him training lawyers, so I rate him. And people who know me very well know I don't rate a lot of people. And so I'm just thrilled that he can do this session today.
I've been asked to speak about communication. What I'm doing with you right now is I'm communicating with you, and communication is a huge topic, and no doubt it is the sort of thing that we will hear time and time again, that communication is even more important now during the pandemic than it has ever been, and these tend to be sweeping statements that are made when we really do need levels of communication to be very, very high, and I would agree with that. However, they are slightly the same sort of statements that we get every time that there's a general election, along the lines of, well, this is the most important election of a lifetime. It would appear that every single general election we have seems to be the most important election of a lifetime, or of a generation. I'm not suggesting that communication is not important right now. It is especially important right now, but it's important all the time. And it's important whether you are leading the country and you are giving messages to your country. And I'm not making any political comment. It's very important that you know that I'm not making any political comment about any political leaders I may or may not mention or refer to. Or indeed, if you're communicating like this, as I am to all of you through the medium of a machine, or indeed if you're talking to a family member or to a friend or to somebody you live with, communication is really extremely important, and it's an art. I do genuinely believe it's an art. And I think our levels of communication are being challenged a little bit at the moment, because I'm having to communicate to you in a medium that is not normal to me. It's not normal to any of us. This is not how we are. We're not born with cameras about 18 inches away from our noses and go around like that, even though there might be a generation for whom this is going to become somewhat more normal. But as far as human beings are concerned, it is my belief that we're herd creatures. We like to be in the presence of one another. And so much of communication is obviously what we say, but there's also a lot of communication which is non-verbal. And I'd like to have a look at a bit of, around the non-verbal aspects of communication, as well as the verbal aspects of communication, and just as well as looking at what communication actually, well, what it really means. So I'd like to start off with what communication really means. Then, as I say, I'll look at some of the verbal aspects of communication and some of the non-verbal aspects of communication. And as I said at the start, I welcome all of your thoughts and all of your questions on this. And I will stick to my time. I said I'd speak for about half an hour, and I'll stick to that so that we have plenty of time for any of your thoughts on this. So there's a lovely quote from George Bernard Shaw that goes along the lines of the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And what happens in communication? There's a theory of communication, a mathematical theory of communication that was published in 1948 by Professor Claude Shannon, and essentially that the communication follows 5 steps. Firstly, there is a source, and the source is you or me. In this instance, it is me. Then step 2 is encoding. So that's what I want to communicate with you. So I want to communicate with you my thoughts on communication, how important it is, why it matters, and why it matters to really think about it very carefully, because we don't want to fall into the trap that there's been an illusion that it has taken place, to quote George Bernard Shaw. And the third aspect of communication is the channel by which we are communicating. So that could be, for example, right now I'm communicating via Zoom. It could be any online platform. It could be face-to-face. It could be over the phone. It could be via WhatsApp, any form of text, any form of social media. It could be via text. It could be via email. It could be via letter. There are all sorts of channels of communication, and it's very important that we think about that channel of communication. And what are the differences? There are lots of differences with the different channels of communication. Then we move on to the decoding, and the decoding, this is the 4th aspect of the 5 aspects of communication, according to Claude Shannon. The decoding is how you will firstly hear and receive my information, and then how do you decode it? How do you take that on board, and what do you understand? That's the crucial bit. What do you actually understand? So often communication breaks down because I have a particular message that I want to communicate to you, and I think I've communicated that and you've picked up something totally different. So it's very important for me to understand that the fifth aspect, the receiver, is as important as me, the source. It is, all of the aspects are really, really important. And to pick up on a couple of those, firstly, the source, me. It's really important that I think about my own personality when I'm communicating. And we will all have different personalities. We know this. Many of you will have gone through various psychometrics. So whether that's Myers-Briggs, or whether that's Insights, or whether that's DISC, or many, many others. And we know that essentially these all boil down into about 4 main platforms. And this goes right back to the work of Carl Jung. And essentially there are 4 main personality types. And this is not a session about personality types. I mean, there'll be lots of other sessions around personality types, of course, that we can do, but you'll all be familiar with the 4 main personality types. And what I'd like to do is just spend a few moments on each of those and use some of the language that we get from DISC and Myers-Briggs and refer to the colors from Insights. Many will be familiar with the 4 main colors. You've got your reds and your drivers, so known, and then your blues, your analyticals, your yellows, your expressives, and your greens, your team players. And without wanting to spend too much time about any form of self-analysis or looking at your own analysis, if this is something that you're familiar with, you'll know maybe where you sit in that quadrant. And if this is something that you're not familiar with, I'm very happy to engage with anybody in the question and answer session a bit more about this. And I also have some information that I will send to Sally, and that can be passed around to all of you, which goes through some of this in a little more detail. And there are various questionnaires that you can have a look at just to give you a sense of where you might sit. But the important thing here when it comes to communication is to understand one's own preference when it comes to delivering and receiving information. So if you were, for example, a driver, if you were the driver type, and the drivers tend to be characteristics, they tend to be very high energy, tend to be, this is a generalization, of course, they tend to be people who prefer brevity, people who prefer getting to the point very, very quickly, and often, and again, this is a generalization because if you are listening to me and you identify as a driver, often drivers cannot be the world's greatest listeners. It doesn't mean to say that if you're a driver, you're not a great listener. We can, of course, all have other skills as well, but just as a generalization. So if you're a driver, you're going to prefer to give information in a very short, very brief manner, very, very short sentences, sentences of 5-6 words, something like that, lots of punctuation, lots of full stops, and it becomes very, very staccato. And it's about understanding how that can be perceived by people who are the opposite type of personality to you. So, for example, moving on to an analytical, if you were a driver and you were talking to a room full of analyticals and you're coming out with very, very succinct, short, punchy statements, it may well create a feeling with the analyticals that you're not necessarily hoping it will create. It can actually produce a feeling of fear and anxiety, because as an analytical, and a traditional analytical is somebody who will, as the name suggests, spend a lot of time analyzing things, very, very keen on detail. And you'll know, I mean, the analyticals out there, if any of you are analyticals, you'll know who you are. You'll enjoy a good spreadsheet, really enjoy detail. I notice one of you smiling at that, a little bit of self-recognition, and that's fine. That's absolutely as it is, and it's lovely. It's lovely that we have that. I mean, it's lovely that we have people who really, really focus on details. We need people who are focused on details, do we not? Otherwise, we wouldn't get anywhere. So it's about understanding that if you're one type of personality, which we all are, how does your preferred method of delivering information, and indeed your preferred method of receiving information, influence the way in which you communicate with other people? It's not, and I would stress this, it is not about changing your personality. Please don't try and change who you are. You are who you are. Don't be anyone else. Everyone else is already taken. That's like misquote from Oscar Wilde there. But do be yourself. It's really important to be yourself. Be your authentic self. But just think about your audience, and you might need to adapt slightly. So if you know, for example, that you are, and let's flip this round, you're an analytical, and you love detail, and you're all into the numbers, you're into the statistics, you're into the fine points, absolutely wonderful. If you're communicating with somebody who you know to be a driver, who you know is very, very direct and to the point, and is not a details person, then if you are communicating with them and you're trying to influence them or persuade them in some way, and you bombard that person with endless detail, with a 500-page document, which you know very well they're not going to read, then essentially communication can break down, and you haven't achieved effective communication, because they won't get to that point. To tell you a very quick story about that, a very good friend of mine with whom I went to university works in the United States in the State Department, and part of her role is to advise whoever is the person sitting behind the big desk in the Oval Office on what her findings are. And she's been doing that job for a number of years, and she's worked with the past two presidents of the United States of America. And I think it's fair to say that we have two, and I make no political comment, we have two very different personality styles in the 45th president of the United States of America and the 44th president of the United States of America. So we're talking about Presidents Trump and President Obama. And thinking about their preferred style of communication, my friend from university is a classic analytical, and she's all about the details, and had a very, very good working relationship with the 44th president of the United States, and would go in on a monthly basis to the Oval Office to present and to communicate with the president on her findings on her particular area of research. And prior to the meeting, a large document would have been delivered to the Oval Office, which would have been read and noted, and there would be some detailed questions, and a long presentation, I mean 45-minute presentation, which is a long time in the world of politics, would have been listened to in almost total silence, but with a sort of a barrister level of interest and forensic detail in the topic. Switch to a new person in the job, the 45th, who, and again, I make no political comment about either of these two presidents, we will all agree, I have no doubt, is a very different personality, much more, I mean, look at the style of communication that we have from the President of the United States of America, a lot of it through the medium of Twitter. It's a very short, very brief, minimal sentences. You have somebody who has a very different preferred style of delivering and receiving information. And when my friend went into the very first meeting with the new president, she and her team delivered a presentation in exactly the same style as they had done so with the 44th. So a 45-minute presentation, expecting it to be listened to in silence, and all of the pre-work, the pre-reading having been carried out. Of course, it became very apparent very quickly, within about 90 seconds, that the documents that had been sent through had not been read, and the attention span was on the way out, shall we say, and other things started to take precedence, to the point where they didn't really know whether they should finish the conversation or not, and they ended it very, very quickly. Now, the lesson that they learned, and this is where effective communication is really important, it's not about, she's not going to change who she is, but what they did was they adapted their style very, very quickly. They broke the information down into sections that they knew the new president would be interested in, and they spoke in a manner that they knew would engage him, and now have a reasonably decent working relationship. So the point to this story is that it's not about changing who you are, it's about understanding who your audience is and understanding your own preferred style. And if your preferred style of delivering and receiving information does not match your audience's preferred style of delivering and receiving information, then things are potentially going to go a little bit awry on that. To mention a couple of the other other personality styles. You've got the expressives. So these are people who tend to, as the name would suggest, be very, very expressive, very easily distracted, have a low boredom threshold, and love a good story, absolutely love a good story. So again, thinking about if you're that type of personality, if you're an expressive and you like to tell a good story, and you can sometimes be distracted and you go off on a tangent, or you start talking about something else, and sometimes you don't finish a particular aspect of what you're talking about, but you come back to it a bit later, that's all very well. But I would imagine for many of you, I'm sure Sally would agree with me in this, I'd imagine, for example, in court, if you start rambling off on a particular story and then go off on another story and then come back to another story, you might get a word or two from a learned colleague up on the bench telling you to get to the point.
Yeah.
So it's really important to know that, and just to understand it's fine. If you're a storyteller, a natural storyteller, fine, but you've got to keep these things to the point. And then finally, you've got your team players who are generally very, very good listeners and very nurturing, very caring. It's all about being really patient, often with team players, and just letting a team player take their time to get to their point. And this is all absolutely fine. What you are is wonderful, and it's really important that we're all different. It would be terrible if we were all the same, but it's about understanding you've got, certainly in a one-to-one situation where you can, you've got to try and understand how your audience prefers to receive that information and deliver it in that way. So when I work with, and the vast majority of my work is in the legal sector with lawyers, and I will look for the signals of what type of lawyer I'm working with. If it's a one-to-one conversation, am I working with a managing partner who's a real driver, or a managing partner who's a real analytical, or am I working with the expressive type, or is there a mixture? And now this is the interesting one as well, because often in communication, it's not just going to be on a one-to-one. You're going to be with a group of people. So right now I have a group of people in front of me. I don't know. I've been listening to you all when you were doing your introduction and your gratitude. And even in the gratitude, even in things that we are grateful for, even in the way you're expressing yourself, I can pick up some clues. Not because I'm special, I'm not special, it's merely because this is my job and I'm very, very interested in it and very passionate about it, about your types of personality. I think, so we've got different types of personality here. And so I can work with that. What I will do when I've got a mixture, and this is an important one, when I've got a mixture of personality types, which I have in front of me right now, is that I will try and incorporate little things for each particular style of personality, the preferences. So I might give a little bit more detail. I might refer to, for example, and I probably will a little bit later, to an article in the Harvard Business Review, and the analyticals will love that because there's a little bit of science there and it's a nice name, and we'll be very excited about that. I sometimes will speak in very short, punchy sentences for the drivers. I'll talk another example. I told you a story a moment ago that would particularly appeal. The team players will like that. The expressives will love that. They'll love a good story. And I will talk a bit about stories in a moment and why they work. So it's all about incorporating different things that you can. You can't do it all the time. Don't try and please all people all of the time. It simply won't work. But you can put little bits in that will resonate, and there will be bits where some of you will think, oh yeah, no, that's interesting, I'll pick up on that, and there'll be other bits where maybe you've been distracted by what's going on in your room. We're all at home. You've been distracted by that lovely big iced coffee that you're having. You might still be harking back to how successful your barbecue was this morning. I am very impressed that somebody was having a barbecue this morning. I don't know where you are, but I'll tell you what, there'll be no barbecues happening where I am. It's absolutely morning. Impressed by that.
The north of England.
Oh well, see, I'm just a sort of, I'm a southerner. I'm a soft southerner. It's about 5 degrees down here, which to me is Arctic. But if you're a tough northerner, that's sort of a t-shirt, isn't it? Really. So you may well be harking back to that. But the point is, I will always try and put in little bits that will appeal to different people, and there's a whole series of things that you can do, which in the information back that I'll send to Sally, there are lots of ideas Professors Honey and Mumford came up with a study about different learning styles and the things that you can do to include into a presentation, shall we say, that will appeal to different learning styles. And I'd encourage you to have a look at that. It's Honey and Mumford Learning Styles, and it'll be in the document that I'll send to Sally, and that can be forwarded to all of you. But I mentioned I wanted to talk about the role of personality, but I also now want to turn my attention, and indeed your attention, to the role of language and the words that we use. And I mentioned the Harvard Business Review a moment ago, and in the document that I'll send through, the Harvard Business Review, I've reprinted an article from the Harvard Business Review that came out in 2002 around personality and persuasion. So it's all about communication, and it's about the types of words, and words are really powerful. Words are really, really important. And the language that we use when we are trying to communicate. So what do you want to communicate? What are the best words that you're going to use? Now, obviously we can't think of time, otherwise communication would take an absolute age. It's really simple. If you want a cup of coffee, you want a cup of coffee. You don't need to really think about the types of words, although, I mean, there's a lot of difference between the word want and phrasing would like. Little things. I have found, just as a little aside, and it's a little tip, whenever I've needed somebody to do something, or I want them to do something, and in particular if it's a client, like for example, if I've double booked myself, and it happens, you know, we're human, we make a mistake, and I need somebody to change a time, but essentially I instead of just me asking them to change a time, using little words like would you be willing. It's fascinating using words, using a phrase like, would you be willing? Very few people are unwilling to do something if you ask them nicely, very, very few. So really think about the words that you use, the type of language that you use. The Harvard Business Review talks about personality style. So I've mentioned the different types of characteristics. They just use different words. So they talk about skeptics, they talk about saboteurs, they talk about leaders, so on and so forth. And they've identified through a study a number of buzzwords, if you will, that really resonate and really work particularly well with those different types of personalities. And again, you might not always be able to use these things, but it's very, very important that if you are in a situation where you're trying to convince, you're trying to persuade, you might be trying to inspire, thinking about the language that you use, and the words do matter. And again, I have no doubt that Sally will back me up on this, being a barrister, and understanding the power, the real power of language. And I would encourage you, and I mentioned stories earlier, I would encourage you to think about the power of storytelling. There are so many things I could talk about when it comes to verbal communication. The words that we use, the words we use about ourselves, the words we use about other people, the words we use when we're trying to motivate and inspire. But where you can, and if you can tell a story, you've got people, because we all love a story, don't we? We all. That's why we watch Netflix. That's why we read books. That's why we go to the theatre. I know we can't go to the theatre at the moment, and you might not be a theatre goer, but it's what we remember. Any of you who have small children may well be reading stories to them. Those of you who were a small child once, but I think we can all fall into that category. Hopefully, I don't think we're all born at this age. Hopefully we had parents who read us stories, or we had guardians, or we had family members or friends or siblings who read stories to us. We love stories. That's how we learn our history, our culture, our background, where we come from. And what happens? So when I told you a story about my friend with President Obama and President Trump, what happens is, initially, as we go into that storytelling mode, what happens is oxytocin starts getting released in us, and we get a little bit happy because we start thinking, oh, good, somebody's going to tell us a story, and we like that, and you'll listen to me. If you want to get people's attention, tell a story, weave a story into something. So then we tell the story, but like any good story, there has to be it can't just be happy all the time. There has to be a bit of conflict. There was a study from the University of Birmingham, Professor Gana Poglevna, who identified, after having watched and analyzed something like 8,000 movie scripts, that the most successful movie script followed a pattern and an arc, and it's very simple. It's happy, sad, happy. So we need that element of conflict. So I introduced an element of conflict. You all knew what was going to happen after I set up, oopsie, I've hit my camera. As you set up the element of oxytocin, so there we are, everybody's happy. My friend was happy with President Obama. Then here comes the conflict. It's a new president, different personality style. What's going to happen? So this is what happens here is then dopamine starts getting released. No, not dopamine. Sorry, cortisol starts getting released into the body, and cortisol is the stress. And we've probably all got quite a lot of cortisol in our bodies right now with the stress of being under lockdown and what's going to happen and the fear of uncertainty. So you don't want to release too much cortisol, especially when people are having a little bit of a cortisol overload. But we need that in the story. But then quickly come back in with the dopamine. And that's the bit that we all love. We all love a good hit of dopamine. People search out dopamine all the time. Dopamine you get when you put something on LinkedIn and people start liking it, and then you think, oh, I've got another like, and then I'll just have another look, and there's another like. Or on whatever social media, and people start liking things, whatever it may be. We get a lot of dopamine. I would imagine that Joe Wicks, the body coach, has got. I mean, his body just must be coursing with dopamine now that he has millions of people like his workouts every morning. I think one of you said you're grateful for online workouts. So there we are, tying things back into what people say. By the way, always very, very nice. It's a really, really lovely technique that people use to just engage, demonstrating that I've listened to you. So if you can get the story, and just remember, really, really simple, happy sound happy, and you release these chemicals, inside us. And what happens is you want to leave people with the dopamine, because that's the happy one. Because we do want people to be, hopefully, we want people to be in a happy state when we finish our story. And finally, I mentioned, because I'm going to open this up to questions, and I'm getting some questions coming in on chat, and I'll have a look at those in just 1 second. Thank you to those. Actually, no, let me deal with this one now. Would I recommend storytelling only when speaking, or would it work in writing, in the application forms? Questions such as, why do you want to become a barrister? That's a very interesting question. I'd love Sally to respond to that as well. Sally, are you shaking your head on that one?
Yeah, so we could deal with it in questions. I sit on scholarship applications, pupillage applications. No, it witters on. And I sit with different colleagues with different personality types that you've outlined. It's so fascinating, your presentation. But just briefly, no, it distracts. We haven't got time. And often at your stage, I think that's one of our students, it's often littered with all sorts of nonsense, if I may say so. So no, but in an interview process, it's different, and it's rather interesting because you've got real people. Particularly now where students are going to have to make applications, and trainees be interviewed in this forum here as we're speaking, on Zoom or MS Teams, largely the ones that are used now. You do have to keep people's attention. And so storytelling might be more appropriate there. But I would say, if I get an application with some sort of story, I haven't got time, and then littered with spelling mistakes, poor grammar, all sorts, no, don't do it. Stick to the facts and stick to the evidence.
Well, there you are. You heard it here first, and I think I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, obviously, I'm going to agree. Otherwise, I'll get cross-examined and taken down.
No.
No, but Sally, I do agree. Sally, I do agree with you on that. You haven't got the time. So I think it's a great question. I really do. And I would take the advice of Sally, which I would second. And I would say, if I disagreed, I would say that. There isn't the time for a long story. People haven't got the time. You imagine how many applications are arriving on people's desks the entire time. And the potential for that just being, no, I haven't got the time for that. But then in the interview situation, when you've got real people, if it's appropriate, yes. And there was another one, really interesting question. What is your view on speaking with metaphors? Oh, that's fascinating. We speak in metaphors all the time. We use so many metaphors, and we often use metaphors that we don't even know we're using. Be really careful about some of the language and some of the metaphors that we do use. And while when that question came up, I'm going to, I don't want to give endless examples of metaphors. We like metaphors. It's a good storytelling technique. It makes us think, and it can often be used. For example, politicians use metaphors a lot. A lot of leaders use metaphors. Be careful about how your metaphor lands with your audience, though. How does your metaphor make people feel? Metaphors that are based around family, going on a journey. When we talk about something, a project being it's my baby, I'm on this journey, we're on this journey together. They tend to work quite well. There are metaphors, though, that can sometimes alienate. So, for example, a lot of people you'll hear talking about wanting to drive change. Now, driving, obviously, it's a driving metaphor, and it can actually put people off, because it can sometimes make people think, well, actually, they're the driver. So what does that make me? Does that make me just purely a passive passenger in the backseat? I have no control over this. Equally as well, and you'll all have your own views on this, but if you think about what's going on right now with the pandemic, if you think about the language that's being used, we are we not, hearing a huge amount of military and wartime and battle metaphors going on. This is a battle, this is a war, the fight against. And it's very interesting. I mean, you'll all have your own opinions on this and whether it works. In particular, people who've been having any form of illness, serious illness, talking about actually not particularly enjoying hearing about their particular fight with or their battle with, because there are lots of implications. My point to all of this is, we like metaphors. Be very mindful of the metaphors that you are using. I'm going to show you in a moment, I'm just going to show you a book that I would recommend if you're interested. So the questioner, with regard to what's your view on speaking with metaphors, if you're interested, and I suggest that you are, because you wrote the you wrote the question, Hina. The book that I'd recommend is, let's hold it on the screen there, we'll put it back a bit there. It's called Winning Minds by Simon Lancaster. Winning Minds by Simon Lancaster. I'm not Simon Lancaster. Simon Lancaster is not my pseudonym. It's very important you know this. I would never dream of trying to sell you something from stage online. It would be deeply inappropriate. I have no shares in the book. It's very important that you know that. This is a really good book. Look at the amount of, as you can see, you'll love this. Barristers will love this. Lawyers will love this. Lots of.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I'm going to order it.
Love it. It's a really lovely book. Now, Simon Lancaster is a speechwriter. He was a speechwriter for a number of cabinet ministers in Tony Blair's government, people like Alan Johnson, who I think is a great speaker. And again, I'll make no political comment about the politics of the names I've just mentioned, but I think you'd agree with me that you've got people like Tony Blair, Alan Johnson, who are still great communicators. They may not be in the forefront of politics, but they're still there. Simon Lancaster has a whole section on metaphors. It's well worth having a look at. It's a really easy book to read as well. It's got lots of white space. It's a lovely, easy book. It's not too heavy. It's got lots of examples, lots of things that we can do, lots of tables, lots of graphs. I promise you I'm not trying to sell you the book. Simon is, he's not in the next room saying go and plug my book. But it's one of the books that I use on a very, very regular basis. You'll see by all the little markers I have in there. And I have lots of books. You see behind me, I've got lots of books on these topics. But this one and about another half dozen others actually stay on my desk, and I refer to them on a very regular basis. Just before we get a few more questions in, because I'm looking at the time now, I did mention that I was going to talk about the non-verbal aspects of communication. There are lots of non-verbal aspects of communication. I think it's worthwhile not obsessing. You don't all need to become body language gurus. I think when people start proclaiming themselves as a guru, it's time that they really do self-isolate for quite a long time. It's more about being aware of how you come across and what your body language is saying about you, and is your body language backing up what you are saying about you, or is your body language in some way not congruent with the message that is coming out verbally? So really thinking about the way in which you come across. And my advice to you would be to just take a few moments before an important moment of communication to think, well, how do I want to be perceived? And therefore, what do I actually want people to think of when, not just when they hear me, but when they're looking at me? Do I look like I'm engaged with other people? Do I look like I want to be there? Do I look like I want to actually communicate with other people? And especially, and this is a message that's very relevant to now, given that we are doing this in a manner where essentially, I mean, I can see you're in the little thumbnails up on the top of my screen, and I'm getting some nodding heads, which is very nice. And I have to say, this is more than I would normally get. Normally there's just a whole load of names, or people quite simply doing this. That's what you get. That's what I mean, and that's about the level. That's about the level of input and feedback you get. When we're in a room, we pick up on all of these signals. I pick up on what's going on in the room. I can see whether somebody's just beginning to slump slightly, or losing it, or whether they want to say something. Right now, though, I have nothing. I have absolutely nothing other than this screen. So I have to be particularly mindful of my non-verbal communication as well as my verbal communication. And so what's going on in that? And one thing I would say, and this is just as a general tip, and I really like the fact, Sally, you mentioned that you've had an appearing on Zoom webinar. There are loads of appearing on Zoom webinars, but you've all taken it to heart, because it's all brilliant. Because when you are all introducing yourselves, yes, we're not getting the looking up the nostrils or the looking down. I mean, right now, and I go on about this, I bang on all the time. My laptop is on about sort of 7 books underneath it, just to raise it, so I'm not looking down. It's really important that, and this is a key thing that I would say to anyone in any moment of communication, is be present. Be really, really present with your audience. So right now, I mean, you can't see, I'm obviously sitting, but I'm not sort of reclined back in my chair. My spine is aligned. I'm sitting up. And that's the advantage of raising the camera of the laptop up. And I'm literally, my body weight is forward. I'm leaning in. Many of you will know the book written by Sheryl Sandberg, Lean In. And my body weight is literally, I'm on the front foot. My body weight is forward. It's as if you watch Prime Minister's questions now, well, I say now, anytime, but the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition, they have the dispatch box and they lean on the dispatch box, they lean in. The body language is about leaning into people. It's really very, very important, that. And by the way, just as an aside, and you can tell what type of personality I probably am now with my endless little asides, if you're interested in communication and how people communicate on the public scale, and those of you who are, I mean, you're all involved in the law in some way, shape or form, and we now have a leader of the opposition who, of course, as you will well know, was a barrister, and it absolutely knows what he's doing. And it's fascinating watching 2 different personalities, one of whom is a I mean, ruthless, details, straight down the line, no fluff barrister, who is questioning a prime minister who clearly, in my opinion, is really suffering from the fact that he has no audience in a socially isolating House of Commons. It's very, very interesting, very interesting. So my point about non-verbal communication is just think, how do you wish to come across? What are you doing? Are you engaged with the audience? What are your hands doing? You can see my hands moving around because I'm engaged with you. What are your eyes doing? You can see I'm making eye contact with you. I'm looking at the camera for the vast majority of the time. And when we do have a world in which so much of our communication now is digital, it's really even more important to be aware of that. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is a skill. It is not a skill that is beyond the wit of humankind, looking down the lens of a camera and being engaged. And you really need to, it's literally like you need to suddenly switch it on. You suddenly need to switch it on in 10 minutes time when this finishes. I'll still be me, but I can just turn this down a little bit. But right now I need to communicate with you, and there needs to be just that bit more energy with my presence with you. Yeah. So I'd like to, I mean, thank you for the questions that have been coming in. I welcome any more. Sally, I welcome any of your comments as well.
Yeah, so firstly, can we give Luan our virtual clap? We do this because he's finished a formal.
Oh, I get a virtual clap, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Even the people who are probably... Yeah, look, eating. And that was really, I think we could have actually preferred you to carry on But you know, there's no great time, but it's important that we all get as much out of it. So that was really good. I mean, I knew it was going to be good, but yeah, it was really, really good and really useful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on. It was lovely. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was really, really good.